I'm Margaret Sterling, 78, a woman, and my own son tried to convince me I was too old to deserve my own home. Not this house, the one I'm sitting in now with its quiet rooms and ghosts of laughter from Christmases past. No, he wanted the other one, the one made of pine logs and stone and 50 years of my life. He wanted the cabin. He wanted it not for himself, but for his daughter, my granddaughter Jessica, because in his words, young people deserve a head start. The implication, of course, was that old people, people like me, were at the finish line and should have the grace to step aside. The cabin sits on the shore of Lake Cypress, nestled in a grove of old-growth birch trees. My husband, David, and I found the land in the spring of 1974. We were young then, with two small children, my daughter Sarah and my son Robert, and not much more than a beat-up Ford and a dream. The parcel was a tangled mess of undergrowth and rock, but when we pushed through to the water's edge and saw the sun setting over the glass-still lake, we knew. It was ours. We bought it with every penny we had saved, and a promise from my father, who co-signed the modest loan. We didn't hire a construction crew. David was an engineer by trade but a carpenter by heart. He drew the plans himself on a stack of diner napkins during a celebratory dinner. That first summer we lived in a tent. David and I would work from sunup to sundown, clearing the land, pouring the foundation. Sarah, who was 7, would make bouquets of wildflowers, while Robert, only 5, would supervise from a tree stump, a serious expression on his little face. I remember the smell of fresh-cut pine, the sting of sweat in my eyes, and the deep, bone-deep satisfaction of building something with my own hands. I learned to mix mortar, to lay stone for the great hearth that would become the heart of the home. David taught me how to use a level, his calloused hand guiding mine, his voice a low, patient rumble against the buzz of the cicadas. That cabin wasn't just built with wood and stone, it was built with us. It was built with our arguments over window placements and our shared silence watching thunderstorms roll in over the lake. It was built with the lullabies I sang to the children as they fell asleep on a mattress on the subfloor, the scent of sawdust their blanket. It was built with the fish David caught and I fried, the berry pies I baked from bushes we found in the woods, the splinters I pulled from Robert's small fingers. Even then, I could see the difference in my children. Sarah loved the doing. She was right there with me, her hands in the dirt, helping me plant the garden that would later feed us all summer. Robert, however, loved the having. He loved telling his friends back in the city, "My dad is building us a house, a real log cabin." He was proud of the asset, of the status it conferred, more than the work that went into it. I once asked him to help me stain the porch railings. He complained for 10 minutes, got a smudge of stain on his shirt, and declared he was no good at this stuff before wandering off to skip stones on the lake. David just sighed and ruffled his hair. "He's a different kind of boy, Maggie," he'd said. "He's got his eye on the destination, not the journey." I didn't understand then what a profound and painful truth that would turn out to be. As the years passed, the cabin became our sanctuary. It was where Sarah learned to swim, where Robert caught his first fish, a tiny sunfish he insisted we mount. It was where we weathered job losses and celebrated promotions. It was where a teenage Sarah cried on my shoulder over her first heartbreak, and where a college-aged Robert brought his first serious girlfriend, Brenda. Brenda, even then, she had a way of assessing everything with a quick, calculating glance. She didn't look at the hand-stitched quilts I'd made, she asked what brand the kitchen appliances were. She complimented the view, but in a way that sounded like she was pricing it. "This property must be worth a fortune now," she'd remarked to Robert, loud enough for me to hear. Robert, so eager to impress her, puffed up his chest and agreed. "One day it'll be mine," he said with a laugh. I remember a small, cold knot forming in my stomach. David heard it too. Later that night, as we sat by the fire, he took my hand. "We need to be clear about this place, Maggie," he said, his voice serious. "This cabin is for everyone. It's not a prize to be won, it's a legacy to be shared." We agreed then and there, though we never thought we'd have to put it into writing. We thought family would understand. David passed away 8 years ago. The last week of his life was spent at the cabin as he'd wished. He sat in his favorite armchair, the one with the worn leather arms, and looked out at the lake he loved so much. Our children and grandchildren came. Sarah, her husband, and their 2 boys, who filled the rooms with a happy energy that David soaked in like the sun, and Robert, Brenda, and their daughter Jessica. Jessica was a quiet girl, always with her nose in her phone. She was 19 at the time and seemed vaguely annoyed by the rustic setting, the spotty Wi-Fi. I watched my son and his wife through the haze of my own grief. Robert was efficient, handling funeral arrangements with a brisk detachment. Brenda was a whirlwind of performative sorrow, bringing me cups of tea I didn't want and patting my arm with a touch that felt more like a claim than a comfort. After David was gone, the cabin became a place of quiet pilgrimage for me. I'd drive up from the city for a few weeks every summer and again for a week in the fall when the leaves turned to fire. It was where I felt closest to him. I could sit on the porch and almost hear his voice in the rustle of the birch leaves. I'd trace his initials, D+M, that he'd carved into the stone of the mantelpiece. The place was more than property, it was the living memory of my marriage. The ambush happened on a Tuesday in early May. Robert had called the week before. "Mom, Brenda and I want to come over and talk about a few things," he'd said. His voice had that smooth, almost too pleasant tone he used when he was about to ask for something. "Just some financial planning stuff, make sure you're all set for the future." I should have known, financial planning was Robert's language. He was a wealth manager and he spoke of life in terms of assets, portfolios, and returns on investment. He'd long managed what little money David and I had, and he'd done well with it, I had to admit. But his obsession with money had always been a source of quiet friction. He saw our frugality not as a choice, but as a failure of imagination. He couldn't understand why I still darned my own socks or preferred my 15-year-old car to a new one. They arrived at my house in the city just after lunch. Brenda swept in, carrying a ridiculously expensive-looking cake box. "Brought you a little treat, Margaret," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Robert gave me a perfunctory kiss on the cheek that felt more like an inspection. We sat in the living room, the cake sitting untouched on the coffee table between us like a sugary peace offering. I offered them tea and we made small talk about the weather, about Jessica's new job at a marketing firm. Then Robert cleared his throat, placing his leather-bound folio on his lap. "Mom," he began, "as you know, I've been reviewing your assets." It sounded so cold, so clinical. My life, my memories, reduced to a column of figures on a spreadsheet. "You're in a good position," he continued, "but we need to think about strategic transfers to minimize tax burdens down the line. It's about being smart with what you and Dad built." Brenda leaned forward, placing her manicured hand on my arm. Her touch was light, but her grip felt surprisingly firm. "What we're thinking about, Margaret, is the cabin." The cold knot in my stomach was back, tighter than ever. "What about the cabin?" I asked, my voice steady, betraying none of the sudden fear that was washing over me. "Well," Robert said, opening his folio, "it's appreciated significantly. It's a major asset currently valued at just over $400,000, but it's an unproductive asset, it just sits there. You only use it a few weeks a year. It costs money in taxes and upkeep." "It's not an asset, Robert," I said, the words tasting like metal. "It's our home." Brenda gave a little tinkling laugh, as if I'd told a charming but naive joke. "Of course, dear, but in legal and financial terms, it's an asset, and we have an idea that would be a win-win for everyone." Robert took a deep breath, the picture of a reasonable man about to explain a simple concept to a child. "We think you should give the cabin to Jessica." The silence in the room was absolute. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound I usually found comforting but which now sounded like a countdown. I stared at my son, at the face I had once cradled in my hands, and I saw a stranger. "Give it to her," I finally managed to say. "Yes," he said, nodding eagerly. "A direct gift. We've talked to Jessica and she's thrilled. It would give her such a wonderful head start in life. A young person, they can't afford something like this on their own. She could use it or she could leverage it to buy a place in the city. It gives her options. It gives her security." "And what about me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What about Sarah's boys?" Brenda squeezed my arm again. "Margaret, let's be realistic. You're 78. How many more years are you really going to be driving up there by yourself? It's a lot to maintain. This takes the burden off your shoulders. And as for Sarah's boys, well, they're still young. Robert is helping Sarah with college funds for them. This is for Jessica. It's H. Third time. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it stole my breath. They had it all figured out. My life, my future, my other grandchildren, all neatly swept aside to benefit their daughter. Robert, I said, looking him directly in the eye, your father and I built that place with our bare hands. It was meant for the entire family, for everyone. David always said so. He had the grace to look away for a moment, a flicker of something shame perhaps crossing his face, but Brenda was there to shore him up. David was a wonderful man, but he wasn't a financial planner, Margaret. He was a romantic. We're talking about practicalities. This is the most practical, logical solution. It helps Jessica, it reduces your tax liability, and it removes a burden from you. It's the smart move. So I am just supposed to sign away 50 years of my life because it's the smart move. My voice was rising, trembling with a fury I hadn't felt in years. Robert stood up and began to pace, his hands in his pockets. It was a gesture of impatience, of a man whose brilliant, logical plan was being met with frustrating, emotional resistance. Mom, you're not listening. This is about legacy. Your legacy would be helping your granddaughter secure her future. Isn't that what you want, to see your family thrive? My legacy, I said, standing up to face him, my small frame suddenly feeling rigid with indignation, is in every stone of that fireplace and every nail in those floorboards. It is not a checkbook for you to balance. The cabin is not for sale, and it is not a gift to be given. Not now, not ever. The atmosphere in the room turned from tense to arctic. Brenda's smile vanished, replaced by a tight, thin line. Robert looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment, as if I were a stubborn child refusing her medicine. I think we've tired you out, Brenda said, her voice dripping with false concern as she picked up the untouched cake. We'll leave you to think about it. I'm sure once you consider it rationally, you'll see that we're right. They saw themselves out. I didn't walk them to the door. I stood in the middle of my living room, my body shaking, and listened to their car pull away. Then I sank onto the sofa and finally, for the first time since David died, I wept. Not from grief, but from the raw, bitter poison of betrayal. The days that followed their visit were shrouded in a thick, suffocating silence. It was a calculated silence, a weaponized absence. My daily phone call from Robert, once a reliable if brief part of my evening routine, stopped. For the first 2 days, I told myself he was busy. On the third day, I knew it was intentional. He was punishing me. He was waiting for me to break, to pick up the phone and tell him he was right, that I would sign the papers. I tried to go about my life. I tended to my small garden in the backyard. I went to my weekly book club. I tried to lose myself in the familiar comfort of a mystery novel. But a shadow had fallen over everything. The joy was gone, replaced by annoying anxiety. Every time the phone rang, my heart would leap with a pathetic mix of hope and dread, only to sink when it was a telemarketer or my friend Alina from down the street. My daughter Sarah called, as she did every weekend. She lived 3 states away, a reality that had never felt so vast. "How are you, Mom?" she asked, her voice warm and familiar. I wanted to tell her, I wanted to pour out the whole ugly story, to hear her say, he did what? To feel the validation of her outrage, but I couldn't. Robert was her brother. I didn't want to put her in the middle of it, to force her to choose sides in a war I was only just beginning to understand. It felt like a failure on my part, as if my children's inability to be decent to one another was a reflection of my own parenting. So I lied. "I'm fine, dear," I said, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. "Just a little tired." "You should come visit," she said. "The boys miss their Grandma Maggie." The thought was like a ray of sunshine in a dark room, but it was quickly extinguished. The fight, this unspoken, ugly thing, had to be dealt with first. It felt like a disease in the family, and I couldn't in good conscience spread it to her home. A week after the ambush, Brenda called. Her voice was syrupy sweet. "Margaret, dear, I was just calling to see how you were feeling. Robert's been so worried about you." A bald-faced lie. If he was worried, he would have called himself. "I'm feeling just fine, Brenda," I said, my tone cooler than I intended. "Oh, good," she chirped. "I'm so glad. We were concerned you were dwelling on our little chat. You know, Robert's heart is in the right place. He just wants what's best for this family, especially for Jessica. She was asking about the cabin just the other day, making all sorts of plans for it. It's so lovely to see a young person with so much hope." Every word was a carefully sharp. And Dart, Jessica is making plans. You are the obstacle to her hope. Robert is the good son. You are the difficult mother. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She was painting a beautiful picture of a future that could only exist if I erased myself from it. The cabin is not hers to make plans for Brenda, I said, my knuckles white as I gripped the phone. Brenda's sigh was a gust of theatrical disappointment. Oh, Margaret, don't be like that. We're only trying to help. You really should reconsider. It would make everyone so happy. Everyone except me, I thought. When I didn't respond, she delivered her final parting shot. Well, I'll let you go. I know you need your rest. Just know that we love you. She hung up before I could reply. The words, we love you, had never sounded so much like a threat. The siege continued. My birthday came and went. In previous years, Robert and his family would take me out to a nice dinner. This year, a courier delivered a pot of orchids with a small card. Happy birthday, Mom. Thinking of you. Love, Robert, Brenda, and Jessica. The flowers were beautiful, but it was a cold, impersonal gesture, a corporate gift, a reminder of the transaction they wanted, not a celebration of my life. Sarah sent a beautiful hand-painted card from her boys and called to sing Happy Birthday with them, her voice a lifeline across the miles. The contrast was a physical pain in my chest. Loneliness began to eat at me. It was a new kind of loneliness, different from the quiet solitude I'd grown accustomed to after David's death. This was an active, malevolent loneliness imposed upon me by my own child. I started to second-guess myself. Was I being selfish? Was I, as Brenda had so gently implied, just an old woman clinging to the past, unable to see the practicalities of the present? They were chipping away at my resolve, not with loud arguments, but with the corrosive drip of silence and suggestion. I would sit in my armchair and stare at the wall, picturing them in their pristine, modern house, discussing my stubbornness over a glass of expensive wine. The thought made me feel small and powerless. The lowest point came about a month into the siege. It was a Friday afternoon and I was paying bills. I came across the property tax statement for the cabin. It was a significant amount, as Robert had been so quick to point out. Staring at the figure, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. Maybe they were right, it was a lot of money. It was a lot of upkeep, even with the local handyman I hired to check on it. I was tired. The fight was draining the life out of me. For a fleeting, treacherous moment, I thought about calling Robert. I imagined the relief in his voice, the triumphant warmth that would replace the cold silence. I could make it all stop. All I had to do was surrender. I actually reached for the phone, my hand trembling. My finger hovered over the first number of his name on my contact list. What was I doing? Was I really about to trade my soul for a quiet life? Was I going to let my son and his grasping wife bully me into dishonoring my husband's memory? My gaze drifted across the room to the mantelpiece. Tucked behind a framed photo of my grandchildren was an older, dog-eared picture. I stood up and walked over to it, my legs feeling unsteady. I picked it up. It was a photo of me and David, taken by a friend that first summer at the lake. We were standing in front of the half-finished cabin frame. We were both tanned, skinny, and covered in a fine layer of sawdust. David had his arm around my shoulder and he was grinning at the camera, a proud, exhausted, happy grin. I was looking at him, and the love on my face was so open, so unguarded, it was almost painful to see now. I was wearing a paint-splattered work shirt of his. My hair was a mess, and I had never been more beautiful. We were not assets in that picture. We were not unproductive. We were creators. We were partners. We were building a future not of financial security, but of shared joy. We were building a legacy, just as David had said. And it was a legacy of inclusion, of family, of love, not a cash prize for the most entitled grandchild. Holding that photograph, I felt a profound shift inside me. The fog of doubt and exhaustion began to burn away, replaced by a clean, hot anger. It was not the reactive, trembling fury I'd felt in the living room that day. This was different. It was cold, hard, and clear. It was the anger of a woman who had been underestimated, the anger of a matriarch whose family was being poisoned from within. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness. They had mistaken my age for obsolescence. They had mistaken my love for leverage. They were wrong. My hand was steady now as I put the photograph back on the mantel. I turned away from it and walked back to the phone, but I didn't call Robert. I scrolled through my contacts, past his name, past Brenda's, until I found an name I hadn't called in months: Arthur Finch. Arthur had been David's best friend since they were boys. He was a lawyer, semi-retired now, but still as sharp as a tack. He was gruff, opinionated, and fiercely loyal. After David died, Arthur had checked in on me regularly, but as I'd settled into my new routine, the calls had become less frequent. He was the executor of David's will, but more than that, he was a link to my past, a keeper of our shared history. He had been there the weekend we laid the foundation for the cabin. He'd brought a case of beer and a load of unsolicited advice, and he'd worked alongside David until they were both caked in mud. He knew what that cabin meant. I pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring, his voice a familiar, gravelly bark. Arthur Finch. Arthur, I said, my own voice sounding stronger than it had in weeks. It's Maggie Sterling. There was a moment of silence, then his tone softened immediately. Maggie, it's good to hear your voice. Is everything all right? The simple, genuine concern in his question was enough to make my eyes well up, but I blinked the tears away. This was not a call for pity. This was a call to arms. Not exactly, Arthur, I said. I need your help. I need a lawyer. What's wrong? He asked, all business now. Is it the house, the investments? It's the cabin, I said, and it's Robert. I heard him take a sharp breath. What did he do? And for the first time, I told the whole story. The ambush, the financial planning, the talk of unproductive assets and head starts for the young. The pressure, the silence, the manipulative calls from Brenda. I laid it all out, the ugly words filling the quiet of my kitchen. When I was finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could picture him, sitting in his leather chair, his brow furrowed, his jaw tight. Finally he spoke, and his voice was low and dangerous. That boy, he said, and he didn't mean it as a term of endearment, always had more ambition than sense. David worried about it. He worried Robert saw the world as a balance sheet. He paused again. Don't you worry, Maggie, they are not taking that cabin. They are not taking your dignity. You did the right thing by calling me. Now here's what we're going to do. Meeting Arthur was like stepping back into a world where things made sense. He asked me to come to his office the next day, a small, book-lined room in his home that smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco. It was the same office where David and I had signed our wills years ago. The familiarity was comforting, a solid anchor in the churning sea of my emotions. Arthur Finch was a man who seemed carved from granite. At 75, he was still imposing, with a full head of white hair and eyes that didn't miss a thing. He listened to me recount the story again, not interrupting, his gaze fixed on my face. When I finished, he leaned back in his creaking leather chair and steepled his fingers. Classic strategy, he grumbled. Isolate the target, apply emotional and psychological pressure, make them question their own judgment. It's a textbook elder abuse tactic, Maggie, whether they're conscious of it or not. They want you to feel old, confused, and burdensome. They want you to believe that giving in is the path of least resistance. Hearing him name it so starkly, elder abuse, was a shock but a validating one. I hadn't allowed myself to use those words, but in the quiet of Arthur's office, the truth of them resonated. Their argument, Arthur continued, his voice laced with contempt, is predicated on two fallacies. First, that the cabin's only value is monetary. Second, that your right to it diminishes with age. Both are, to put it politely, absolute nonsense. He leaned forward, his expression intense. So we fight back, but not on their terms. We don't get into a screaming match. We don't plead. We don't negotiate. We reclaim the power. You are the matriarch of this family, Margaret. It's time to remind them of that. A sense of purpose, clean and bright, began to fill the spaces that had been hollowed out by doubt. What do? I asked. First, he said, we formalize David's wishes. He always said the cabin was for everyone, correct? Oh, yes, always. Then we make that legally binding. We are going to set up an irrevocable family trust. He explained the concept to me in simple terms. The cabin would be placed into the trust. I would be the primary trustee for my lifetime, in full control of its use and maintenance. After I was gone, a secondary trustee, he suggested Sarah, for her level-headedness, would take over. The beneficiaries of the trust would be all of my grandchildren equally. Jessica and Sarah's two boys, Liam and Ben. The terms of the trust will be explicit, Arthur said, a predatory gleam in his eye. The property cannot be sold. It cannot be used as collateral for a loan. It is to be used and enjoyed by all beneficiaries, on a schedule to be determined by the trustee. It preserves the cabin as a family legacy, exactly as David wanted. It is the perfect, ironclad defense against a hostile takeover by one greedy branch of the family. It was brilliant, it was more than brilliant, it was just. It honored David, it protected the cabin, and it treated all my grandchildren fairly. It wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a moral statement. Robert won't like it, I said, a grim smile touching my lips for the first time in weeks. Oh, I'm counting on it, Arthur chuckled. He'll hate it. It takes his unproductive asset completely off the market. It neutralizes his daughter's financial advantage over her cousins. It's everything his materialistic little heart despises. And the most beautiful part, Maggie, it is an act of profound generosity and foresight. They've been trying to paint you as a selfish old woman. We are going to show them what true matriarchy looks like, providing for and protecting the entire family, not just the loudest branch. Over the next 2 weeks, Arthur and I worked. He drew up the trust documents and I gathered all the necessary paperwork for the cabin's deed. With every form I signed, I felt stronger. I was no longer a victim, waiting for the next psychological blow. I was the architect of my own defense. The feeling was intoxicating. During this time, I maintained radio silence. When Brenda called again, her voice oozing with that sickeningly sweet concern, I was ready. Margaret, just checking in, we haven't heard from you. We're hoping you've had time to think things over rationally. I have, Brenda, I said, my voice calm and even. I've been giving it a great deal of thought and getting some professional advice. There was a slight pause. Professional advice, what do you mean? I mean, I've been speaking with my lawyer, I said, savoring the small, sharp shock that I knew the word would deliver. The silence on her end was longer this time. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the calculations shifting. Your lawyer, she finally said, the sweetness gone, replaced by a brittle edge. Why on earth would you do that? Because it's a significant asset, as you and Robert pointed out, I said, using their own words against them. It's only prudent to seek legal counsel on such matters. I'm sure Robert would agree it's the smart move. I could feel her flustered anger through the phone. I had seized control of the narrative. I'll be in touch soon to arrange a family meeting to discuss my decision, I said. Please make sure you, Robert, and Jessica are all available. A meeting. Yes, I said. I believe this is a conversation we should all have together. Goodbye, Brenda. I hung up the phone, a real, genuine smile on my face. The hunter was now the hunted. They would be stewing, wondering what I was up to, what the lawyer had told me. Their siege of silence was broken, replaced by a new siege of my own making, a siege of suspense. The summons, as I had come to think of it, was sent via a simple phone call. I called Robert directly. It was the first time I had initiated a call with him in almost 2 months. He answered immediately, his voice wary. Mom. Robert, I said, my tone polite but formal. I would like you to come to my house this Sunday at 2 o'clock. I have made my decision regarding the cabin, and I want to discuss it with you, Brenda, and Jessica in person. You've made a decision, he asked, a note of hopeful relief in his voice. He thought he'd won. He thought my silence and my legal counsel were just the last thrashings of a defeated opponent. Yes, it's important that Jessica is there as well, as it concerns her future. This was the bait, and I knew he would take it. Of course, Mom will be there. Is everything okay? He asked, a pathetic attempt to reclaim the role of the concerned son. Everything is perfectly fine, Robert. I'll see you on Sunday. I hung up before he could ask any more questions. The days leading up to the meeting were strangely calm. The anxiety that had plagued me for weeks was gone, replaced by a steely sense of resolve. I felt like myself again, the woman who had helped build a house from scratch, who had raised 2 children, who had navigated 50 years of marriage. I was Margaret Sterling, and I was not going to be pushed around in my own home. Arthur called the day before. Are you ready for this, Maggie? Well, I am, I said. Good, remember the plan, let them talk, let them lay out their assumptions, don't interrupt. Then when they're done, you take the floor. I'll be there right at 2:15. Let them sweat for a few minutes first. And one more thing. Well, what's that? Enjoy it, he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. They've earned every second of this. On Sunday, I woke up feeling rested. I put on a simple but elegant dress, one of my favorites, and a string of pearls David had given me for our 40th anniv. Ursary, I made a pot of coffee and set out some cups, but no cake. This was not a social visit. At precisely 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I opened it to see Robert, Brenda, and Jessica standing on my porch. Robert was wearing what I called his deal-closing suit, and Brenda had a look of smug anticipation on her face. Jessica, bless her heart, just looked uncomfortable, a young woman dragged into a battle she didn't seem to have the stomach for. She wouldn't meet my eye. "Well, come in," I said, my voice even. They settled in the living room, in the exact same spots they had occupied during the ambush. The symmetry was not lost on me. "Mom, you look nice," Robert said, attempting a compliment. "Oh, thank you, Robert." Brenda leaned forward, her smile wide and predatory. "So, Margaret, you said you've made a decision. We're all ears." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, watching them. Robert cleared his throat, unable to stand the vacuum. "Mom, I just want to say," he began, adopting his most sincere voice, "that I know this has been difficult, but I hope you know that Brenda and I were just so proud of you for making the logical choice. It's the right thing to do for Jessica, for the family's future. It shows real wisdom." It was almost comical. He was congratulating me for surrendering to him, for proving him right. Brenda jumped in, her voice dripping with praise. Jessica was just saying in the car how grateful she is, Margaret. She has so many plans. This is going to change her life. She turned to her daughter. "Isn't that right, sweetie?" Jessica looked up, startled. She glanced at me, then at her parents. "Oh, yes, thank you, Grandma," she mumbled, staring at her hands. She looked less like a grateful beneficiary and more like a hostage. They continued for a few more minutes, laying out their vision of the future, Jessica's wonderful new life, the tax benefits, the relief of my burden. I sat in my armchair, the one across from them, and I just listened. I nodded occasionally, my expression unreadable. I let them build their entire fantasy, brick by imaginary brick. Just as Robert was winding down his closing arguments, the doorbell rang. "Oh, excuse me," I said, standing up. Robert and Brenda exchanged a look of confusion. They weren't expecting anyone else. I walked to the door and opened it to reveal Arthur Finch, standing there with his leather briefcase, looking like the wrath of God in a tweed jacket. "Arthur," Robert said, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced. "What a surprise. What are you doing here?" "Margaret invited me," Arthur said, stepping into the room and giving Robert a look that could freeze fire. "I'm her legal counsel." The shift in the room was palpable. The smug confidence drained from Robert's face, replaced by a dawning horror. Brenda's smile tightened into a grimace. They knew they had fundamentally misread the situation. "Please have a seat, Arthur," I said, gesturing to the chair next to mine. He sat down, placing his briefcase on the floor beside him with a soft thud that sounded like a gavel. I turned my attention back to my son. "Robert, Brenda, thank you for sharing your thoughts. I've listened very carefully. And you're right about one thing. It is time for me to think about legacy, and it is time for me to be smart about the cabin." Robert's eyes flickered with a desperate, dying hope. Maybe the lawyer was just here to witness the signing. "I have given this a great deal of thought," I continued, my voice clear and strong, filling the silent room. "I've thought about what your father would have wanted, and I've thought about what it means to be the head of a family." I paused, looking at each of them in turn. Robert, Brenda, and finally Jessica, who was now looking at me with wide, fearful eyes. "And so," I said, "I have decided not to give the cabin to Jessica." The silence that followed my announcement was heavier, deeper than any that had come before. It was the silence of a failed explosion, the dead air after a dud. Robert's face went from pale to a blotchy, furious red. Brenda's mouth opened and closed silently like a fish. What? Robert finally choked out, the word a strangled gasp. What do you mean you're not giving it to her? We had an agreement. No, Robert, I said, my voice remaining perfectly calm. You had an expectation, you delivered a demand, I never agreed to anything. But you said you made a decision, he stammered, gesturing wildly between me and Arthur. You brought a lawyer, we thought. You thought I would roll over and do as I was told, I finished for him. You thought my age made me compliant, you were mistaken. Brenda found her voice, and it was sharp and venomous. After everything we've done for you, the financial advice, the management of your affairs, this is how you repay Robert, by being selfish, by clinging to a dusty old house you barely use. That dusty old house, Arthur cut in, his voice a low growl, is the single most significant creation of your mother's and father's life together, and you speak of it as if it were an inconvenient piece of furniture. I held up a hand, silencing Arthur with a look. This was my stage. You speak of selfishness, Brenda, let us talk about that. Is it selfish to want to honor my husband's wishes? He always said the cabin was for everyone, not for one person to cash in. Is it selfish to want to treat all my grandchildren equally? Or is it selfish to pressure an elderly woman to sign over her most cherished possession to benefit your own child to the exclusion of all others? I turned to Jessica. Her face was pale and she looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Jessica, I said, my voice softening slightly. This is not your fault, but you are an adult and you sat here and went along with this. Did you ever once stop to think about how this would make me feel? Did you ever once think of your cousins, Liam and Ben? Did you think it was fair that you should be given a $400,000 asset while they were not? She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't, she began. Mom and Dad just said. I know what they said, I interrupted gently. Now let me tell you what I have decided to do. Arthur reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sheaf of papers, handing them to me. I took them, the paper feeling cool and solid in my hands, the physical proof of my victory. I have created the Sterling Family Trust, I announced, and I have placed the cabin into it. It is an irrevocable trust. That means the decision is final and cannot be changed. I let that sink in. Robert looked utterly bewildered. A trust. Yes, I am the primary trustee for the rest of my life. I will manage the cabin, I will pay its taxes from my own accounts, and I will decide who uses it and when. After I am gone, your sister Sarah will become the trustee. I saw Robert flinch at the mention of Sarah's name. It was a direct blow to his sense of control. The beneficiaries of this trust, I continued, looking directly at my son, are all three of my grandchildren. Jessica, Liam, and Benjamin, all of them equally. The rules of the trust are very clear. The cabin can never be sold, it can never be mortgaged. It is to remain a place for the family, for all the family to gather and to make memories for generations to come. It is a legacy, Robert, a true legacy, not a bank account. I slid a copy of the trust document across the coffee table towards them. You can read it for yourself. Arthur has made sure it is all perfectly legal and binding. Robert stared at the papers as if they were a snake. He didn't touch them. He just looked at me, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had been so certain of his victory, so sure of his power over me, that he couldn't process his defeat. Brenda was the first to snap. You went behind our backs, she hissed. You schemed with him, she spat, pointing a trembling finger at Arthur. No, I corrected her calmly. You plotted, I protected, there's a difference. You tried to take something, I have preserved it for everyone. You tried to divide this family. I have just ensured its future together. Robert finally stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. He was trembling with rage. I can't believe you, he said, his voice low and shaking. After all I've done, this is the thanks I get. You've always favored Sarah, always. It was the last, desperate cry of a spoiled child who hadn't gotten his way. The accusation was so baseless, so patently false that I almost laughed. I have loved both my children with all my heart, Robert. I said, my voice filled with a sudden, weary sadness. The difference is, Sarah has never asked me to prove it by signing over a deed. That was the final blow. He had nothing left to say. He turned, grabbed Brenda by the arm, and stormed towards the door without another word. Come on, Jessica, Brenda snapped over her shoulder. Jessica stood up slowly. She looked at her parents' retreating backs, and then she looked at me. For the first time, she met my gaze directly. Her eyes were full of tears, but also something new, a glimmer of understanding, of shame. I'm sorry, Grandma, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I know, dear, I said, and I did. She turned and hurried out after her parents. I heard the front door slam shut, and then the sound of their car speeding away down the street. The silence that returned to the room was a peaceful one. The battle was over. Arthur and I sat for a moment, the quiet settling around us. Well, he finally said, a slow smile spreading across his face. I believe that went rather well. So I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. A laugh, a real one, bubbled up from my chest. It did, Arthur, it really did. A week later, I drove up to the cabin. The air was sweet with the smell of pine and damp earth. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Nothing had changed. The stone fireplace, the worn armchair, the photo of me and David on the mantel. It was all here, it was all safe. I walked out onto the porch and sat in the old rocking chair looking out at the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the endless blue sky. I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. I had faced down my own son and won. I had protected my home, my husband's memory, and my own dignity. They had tried to make me small, to confine me to the role of a helpless old woman. But they had forgotten who I was. I was the woman who had built this place. And my foundation was much, much stronger than they knew. The fight for the cabin taught me something I had started to forget in the quiet years of my widowhood. It taught me that my value is not determined by my age or by my utility to others. My worth is inherent. It was forged in a lifetime of love, of work, of joy, and of sorrow. It resides in my memories, in my character, and in the legacy I choose to build. A legacy is not something you give away like a stock certificate. It's something you protect, you nurture, and you share wisely. I learned that silence can be a weapon used against you, but it can also be the space where you find your own strength. And sometimes the most loving thing a mother can do is to say no.